Joining me now is Eric Page. He's a research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada based at Harrow, and he's working on a crop that I think is kind of cool. He's working on winter canola. Welcome here, Eric.
Hey, good morning. How are you doing?
Well, I'm doing well. It is kind of a rainy, crummy week here in the Ottawa Valley, and so I am because I get to host the show, I get to choose the topics. And so to make myself feel better about my flooded basement and my flooded barn, I'm going to talk about things I think are cool, even if no one else does. But
Excellent.
I'm hoping you also think winter canola is super cool. So go ahead.
I definitely think winter canola is cool. Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so catch me up. Yeah, catch me up on the 3 trials you're working on.
Yeah, so we've been working with winter canola for the last couple years with some support from the Ontario Canola Growers Association, and we think it has a really good fit down here in Essex County, southwestern Ontario. And our primary focus has been really generating a lot of producer-focused data, looking at identifying the best planting date. One of the things that we've experienced with winter canola is a lot of questions of like, well, when do I put it in the ground? And there was some previous data that had been put out from OMAFRA, but it was something that we wanted to have a look at and really get a better estimate for southwestern Ontario. And so, for the last couple of years, we've been planting canola from late August through mid-October, and really have come to a good conclusion in terms of when you should be putting it into the ground, which is about mid-September down here.
And how does that compare to, say, winter wheat in that area?
Yeah, winter wheat would be a little bit later. Typically, I think the insurance date for winter wheat obviously is, first week of November, and we'd want you having winter wheat in earlier than that. But winter canola requires a little bit more time in the fall to sort of get up, and the reason that it needs that extra time is that as opposed to winter wheat, the growing point on winter canola is always above ground. So wheat overwinters with the growing point below ground. Winter canola needs to be a little bit hardier, and so it needs just a little bit extra time going into the winter.
So you do some work on variety trials as well, some residue management, establishment trials. I'm quite familiar with spring canola, obviously, and with winter wheat. So, is there an ideal growth stage you want this canola to be in heading into the winter?
Absolutely. And one of the things that we realized from that planting day trial is that you can't be too early. What I don't want to see producers have in their fields is cabbages or cabbage-sized plants going into the winter. Those plants often experience a lot of tissue death, and it's kind of growth for the sake of growth going into the winter. And it actually puts them at a disadvantage when they come out in the spring. They flower later and they yield less, which is kind of counterintuitive. So it's a bit like a curve, right? There's a less optimal early plant date. There's a really bad late plant date. And right in the middle, where we want to see people planting and getting their winter canola in right around, again, mid-September, is that we'd like to have like a donut bagel-sized plant going into the winter. Those plants actually don't lose very much tissue. They're able to get up and flower quickly, and the yield is the highest at those types of plant dates. So that was the whole goal of identifying that sort of optimal plant date, was that initial trial. The other 2 trials, as you mentioned, are we do have this variety trial, and we have a residue management trial that we've put out there. So we're actively trying to register more canola varieties. Right now, there's only a single winter canola variety that's registered for growth in Canada, and that's Mercedes. And we've been working with OMAFRA and a seed company out of the United States to import more canola varieties to try to give producers some greater options.
So then, you have looked at sort of the residue management, that sort of stuff, because of course canola is a very tiny little seed.
Yes.
What's the optimal crop for it to follow then, or what stubble are you putting it into, or stubble at all?
Yeah, canola can be done many different ways depending on the equipment that you have. You can no-till it. More residue is probably a bad thing. So putting it into corn stalk is not a great idea. I don't think many people would, just depending on when you're taking the corn off. But certainly you're prone to having a poorer stand when you put it into corn residue, and also slugs are a concern. They do like to live in heavier residue environments. And so what we're advocating is obviously either following with either no residue if it's coming out of fallow is a great time, and you can have good seedbed preparation and good establishment, or like a lighter residue crop, like if you're going to follow winter wheat, or if you can get your soybeans off in time. That those are better situations for putting canola in. There's still a lot of work to be done in that area, and that's the trial that we're focusing on now, is basically looking at combinations of heavier residues with full till, no till, and strip till, and then looking at that establishment question with canola, because really, if you can get it through the winter and avoid winter kill, canola is a very easy crop to manage. But it's that getting your planting date right and getting it through the winter, and that's a lot to do with, again, establishment, residue management. Once those two things are checked off from an agronomy perspective, winter canola is a pretty easy crop to manage.
And so how do, on the yield perspective, how does winter canola compare to, say, spring canola?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the advantage with winter canola is that it should have a fairly significant yield advantage over spring canola. I would point to the Ontario Canola Growers Yield Challenge this past year, and this is up on their website and publicly available if anybody wants to have a look at that. And I should say that all of my research results are also up there in terms of trial reports, so if anybody's interested in having a look at it. The second place finisher in this yield challenge this past year was a winter canola grower with only 2 or 3 years experience under his belt. So I think that speaks highly to the yield potential. He was able to get a yield of 70 bushels per acre on winter canola, and that was not his best year in terms of his winter canola yields. It just happened to be the year that he had entered the competition. But so there is great potential for that. The other thing that I would highlight about winter canola is that it avoids one of the major issues that spring canola has in Ontario. So there's no issues with Swede midge with winter canola.
That was my next question.
There we go.
Yeah.
Stealing them from you.
Yeah.
It's all about the timing of flowering, right? So, I mean, I was just out having a look at our plots, and we're going to expect to see flowering down here in Harrow probably in the next 2 to 3 weeks. And this is well before Swede midge would ever become a problem for winter canola. So that's the real advantage. You don't have that issue to deal with.
I just about fell off my chair because I still have snow. So 2 to 3 weeks to have flowering just seems not right, but
yes,
also incredible. Now, one of the reasons, of course, that, we talk about winter crops, so fall seeded crops, is, of course, there's that balance of, available labor, right? In the spring, not everything can go in at the same time, so it spreads out that workload. But what about weed management, and specifically sort of, dealing with herbicide resistant weeds? How important is it to have a fall seeded crop in that mix?
Yeah, no, I think it's critical, and so the other half of my research program is weed management. That's what essentially I was hired to do here with Ag Canada, but I do like to dabble with new crops as well. But certainly a fall seeded crop gives you really good weed competition, especially if you can start clean. So the biggest weed problem we would have down here is Canada fleabane, because it's a winter annual species. It's Roundup resistant. It might as well be another Roundup resistant crop just because of its frequency down here. But if you can start clean before you put winter canola in, or even winter wheat, they're both very competitive winter crops. And the nice part, as you mentioned, they spread out the acreage workload, but they also have their highest crop canopy in a period of time when the weeds are traditionally emerging in the spring. So you think about your pigweeds, your lamb's quarters, your ragweeds. In a winter canola or even a winter wheat crop that has a healthy stand, you're basically outcompeting those weeds at the period in which they're coming up. So that's a really big tool for integrated weed management, and that's one of the reasons that I would advocate for a crop like winter canola, because weed management, if it's clean again in the fall, and I hate to keep saying this, if you start clean with it, there's very little weed management that needs to happen in a winter canola crop. And
of course, unlike wheat, of course, it's a broadleaf. So then, of course, you're mixing in sort of that difference as well, right? So definitely, again, sort of adding that diversity, adding another option depending on what weed spectrum you're battling, gives you that other option. So if on the harvest front, like what is the harvest window then? Because then it sounds to me like it would be quite early, in which case that opens up both an opportunity and a challenge post-harvest, because then you've got available acres, but what do you put there? So when would harvest be?
So that is going to depend a little bit on the germplasm. And the reason I say that, it feeds into sort of the variety trial that we have, the performance trial. There are true winters, and then there are early winter hybrids in canola. And the early winters arise from a cross of some spring genetics. And they're about 10 to 14 days ahead of the true winters. So Mercedes, the one that's registered currently in Ontario, is a true winter. And I would expect harvest in Mercedes to be last week of June, first week of July. So you can imagine with some of this other germplasm that we're evaluating right now, the earlies, that would push it back to, third week of June, maybe even a little bit earlier, depending on the year. So you're right, that opens up a big window after, if you foreseeably could take off your canola by the end of June. You still have time to double crop, certainly down here in southwestern Ontario. And I know not everybody in Ontario is going to have the same sort of heat units that we have down here. But we've been running double crop trials, planting date trials with corn, soybeans, and dry beans, simulating the planting dates that you could get in after winter wheat as well as after winter canola. And I can tell you get some really great yield results if you followed winter canola in theory with soybeans or dry beans in that particular case. It just gives you a couple extra weeks in the season, and that makes a big difference both in terms of the germplasm, your maturity group that you're using as a double crop, as well as your yields and when you get it off in the fall. So for us, that's the angle we're really looking at.
And I have livestock, so I just think, oh my gosh, you could put forage in anyway. But that's me.
Yeah, well, you absolutely could. And there's lots of different angles to this, but the corn hybrid that we planted, you could, in theory, put corn in as long as you were taking it off for silage as well.
Right.
Getting it to yield's a little more difficult, but there's also some interest in Western Canada, I know, in potentially taking canola off for forage feed as well. I'm not an expert in that area, but I certainly have seen publications suggesting that that's been explored as well.
Well, I know that they have done it when it gets very badly hailed out. So, but that's never the plan. That's
No.
more the Hail Mary. Let's try and make something of it. All right, Eric, thank you so much for your time today. This has been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you very much.